The shove came without warning, and Samuel Otis Carter hit the porch steps hard, his shoulder taking the brunt of the fall, his white cane clattering somewhere out of reach across the wooden boards. He couldn't see the officer standing over him, couldn't see the badge or the uniform or the expression on the young man's face, but he could hear the contempt in his voice clearly enough. "Stay down," Officer A. Colton barked, as though the 78-year-old man sprawled on his own front porch posed any threat at all. Samuel had survived a war. He had survived the explosion that took his sight 32 years ago on a stretch of jungle road he still sometimes dreamed about. He had survived raising 2 abandoned baby boys alone, blind, with nothing but a small pension and an unshakable sense of duty. He did not deserve to be lying on his own porch, humiliated in front of his neighbors, because of a clerical error neither officer had bothered to verify. What Colton and his sergeant didn't know, couldn't have known, was that in less than 30 minutes, the badges on their chests would mean nothing against the 2 federal agents already racing toward Elm Ridge, the 2 men Samuel had raised from nothing, now coming to save the only father either of them had ever known. This is the story of a debt 30 years in the making, and the day it finally came due. Before we continue, drop a comment below and tell me which city you're watching from right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now, because this channel brings you real stories of justice every week, and you don't want to miss this one. Let's get into it. Samuel Otis Carter had grown up in Elm Ridge, Ohio, the son of a steel mill worker and a seamstress, in a modest working-class neighborhood where everybody knew everybody's business, for better or worse. He'd enlisted in the Army at 19, drawn by a sense of duty that ran deeper than the recruitment posters ever could explain, and he'd served 2 tours before the explosion that changed everything. It happened on a supply route outside a small village during his final deployment, a roadside device that killed 2 men beside him and left Samuel alive but permanently blind, his optic nerves damaged beyond any surgical repair the military doctors could offer. He was 26 years old when he came home to Elm Ridge with a small disability pension, a Purple Heart he kept in a drawer rather than displayed on a wall, and a quiet, private grief he rarely spoke about to anyone. For years, Samuel lived alone in the same small house his parents had left him, learning to navigate a world without sight through sheer discipline and stubborn independence. He memorized every crack in the sidewalk, every turn in his modest kitchen, every sound that told him which neighbor was walking past. The community, in the particular way small working-class neighborhoods often do, looked out for him without ever making him feel like charity. A bag of groceries left quietly on his porch, a neighbor's teenager mowing his lawn without being asked, small kindnesses exchanged for the quiet dignity Samuel carried in everything he did. Then, on a bitterly cold December night when Samuel was 46, everything changed again. He heard crying on his porch, thin, frightened, unmistakably the cries of infants. He found 2 baby boys, no older than 2, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, left by a mother who had been fighting a losing battle with addiction and simply couldn't fight it anymore. A note pinned to the blanket, which a neighbor later read aloud to him, begged whoever found them to give them a better life than she could. Samuel could have called the authorities. Any reasonable person would have understood if he had, a blind man alone with no experience raising children, no financial cushion beyond his modest pension. Instead, he brought the boys inside, warmed them by his stove, and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would raise them himself, blindness and all, rather than let 2 frightened children disappear into a system that too often failed kids exactly like them. He named them Marcus and Elijah Reeves, keeping the surname the note had mentioned, a last thread connecting them to whatever fragments of history their mother had left behind. And from that winter night forward, Samuel Carter, blind, unmarried, 46 years old, became a father. Raising 2 boys without sight tested Samuel in ways he had never anticipated, even after everything the war had already put him through. He learned to identify their footsteps apart from each other before they could walk properly. He learned to cook meals by touch and smell and muscle memory, teaching himself recipes through trial, error, and the occasional minor kitchen disaster the boys would later tell embarrassing stories about. He learned to discipline with his voice alone, A firm, steady tone that both boys understood, even as toddlers, was not to be tested twice. The neighborhood helped in small, steady ways. A retired schoolteacher 2 doors down who taught the boys to read aloud each evening so Samuel could listen and correct their pronunciation from memory of the same books he'd read decades earlier. A widow across the street who drove them to doctor's appointments. A barber down the block who cut both boys' hair for free every month, calling it community service whenever Samuel tried to insist on paying. Marcus and Elijah grew up fiercely protective of their father in return, an instinct that deepened with every year they understood more fully exactly how much he had sacrificed for them. By the time they were 10, they had become skilled at describing the world to him in vivid detail. The color of a sunset, the expression on a teacher's face, the exact placement of an obstacle in his path, developing a kind of intuitive partnership that outsiders often found remarkable. Samuel never let his blindness become an excuse for anything, and he refused to let the boys use it as one either. He taught them structure, discipline, and a deep respect for integrity, drawing constantly from the values that had carried him through his own military service. It was no surprise, then, that both boys grew up captivated by his stories of service, not the horror of the explosion that took his sight, which he rarely discussed in detail, but the sense of purpose and brotherhood he described from his years in uniform. Both boys pursued law enforcement careers after college, drawn by a shared desire to embody the same integrity Samuel had instilled in them since childhood. Marcus joined the FBI, eventually working out of a field office 3 states away. Elijah joined the DEEA, stationed somewhat closer in a regional office just under 4 hours from Elm Ridge. Despite the distance, despite demanding careers that often kept them away for weeks at a time, both men made it a point to call Samuel every single week without fail, and to visit as often as their schedules allowed. They owed him everything, and both of them knew it in the marrow of their bones, a debt neither had ever needed to voice aloud because it simply lived in everything they did. Now, at 78, Samuel still lived independently in the same modest house, his mind as sharp as ever despite the toll 32 years of blindness and advancing age had taken on his body. He moved through his home and his small stretch of neighborhood with the same confident precision he'd developed decades earlier, his white cane an extension of himself rather than a symbol of limitation. Elm Ridge, however, had changed considerably since Samuel's own childhood there. The police department, once a small community-embedded operation, had grown increasingly aggressive in its tactics over the past several years, developing a reputation, quiet but persistent among residents, for careless, sometimes forceful encounters, particularly with elderly and disabled residents who struggled to assert themselves against uniformed authority. Officer Ray Colton had transferred to Elm Ridge only 4 months earlier, eager to prove himself in a department that rewarded aggressive, proactive policing over patience or careful verification. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, a dispatch call came through regarding a reported disturbance at a residence on Miller Street, a call that, due to a transcription error at the county dispatch center, listed the address 1 digit off from its intended target. That single misplaced digit pointed directly at Samuel Carter's front door. Colton paired that shift with Sergeant Dale Whitfield, a 20-year veteran known within the department for his brusque, dismissive manner toward anyone he perceived as wasting his time, headed toward Miller Street without pausing to cross-reference the address against any additional details in the dispatch report, details that, had anyone bothered to check, would have immediately flagged the obvious mismatch between the reported disturbance and the quiet, elderly resident actually living at that address. Samuel was in his kitchen listening to an afternoon news broadcast on his radio when the aggressive pounding began at his front door. "Elm Ridge Police, open up!" Colton's voice boomed through the door before Samuel had even reached it. "One moment," Samuel called out, moving carefully but without panic toward the entryway, his cane sweeping the familiar path he'd walked 10,000 times before. The moment he opened the door, Colton's hand shot forward, gripping Samuel's arm with unnecessary force. "We got a call about a disturbance here. We need to search the premises." "Officer, I believe there's been some mistake," Samuel said calmly, his voice carrying the same measured discipline that had defined him for decades. "I live alone. I haven't had any disturbance here. If you could verify the address you're looking for, I'm certain— Save it, Colton snapped, cutting him off, apparently interpreting Samuel's calm explanation as evasive stalling rather than simple patient clarity. Step aside. I'm happy to cooperate, Samuel said, but I'd ask that you first confirm you have the correct address. My name is Samuel Carter. I've lived at this residence for— I said step aside, Colton repeated, his grip tightening on Samuel's arm, pulling him forward with a force that sent Samuel stumbling off balance on his own porch steps. Whitfield, standing a few feet back, watched with the detached indifference of a man who had long ago stopped questioning his junior officer's methods in the field. Just cooperate, old man, and this'll go a lot smoother, he called out, his tone carrying an unmistakable edge of condescension. Samuel, struggling to regain his footing without the use of his cane, which had slipped from his grip during Colton's forceful pull, tried once more, his voice still steady despite the growing chaos. Gentlemen, I am 78 years old and I am blind. I am not resisting anything. I am simply asking you to verify. The shove came then, sudden and unnecessary, sending Samuel down hard onto the porch steps, his shoulder absorbing the brunt of the impact against unforgiving wood. Across the street, a neighbor named Rosalind Fitch, who had known Samuel for nearly 15 years, had already pulled out her phone the moment the officers arrived, some deep instinct telling her this encounter was headed somewhere it shouldn't. She began recording immediately, capturing everything that followed with growing horrified disbelief.
"Get up," Colton ordered, apparently unmoved by the fact that the man he'd just shoved to the ground was clearly disoriented, clearly disabled, clearly no threat to anyone. "I would appreciate some assistance," Samuel said, his composure remarkable given the circumstances, though a thin note of genuine distress had finally crept into his voice. Whitfield, rather than offering any actual help, crouched down with an air of theatrical skepticism. "You sure you're really blind? Seems like you're navigating this porch pretty well for a blind man." "I've lived in this house for 32 years, Sergeant," Samuel said. "I know every step of it by heart. That doesn't change the fact that I cannot see you, cannot see your badges, and have no way of verifying anything you're telling me without your cooperation." "Sure," Whitfield said, unconvinced, exchanging a knowing glance with Colton that suggested neither man had any genuine intention of reconsidering their approach. "My discharge papers are in the top drawer of my desk in the front room," Samuel continued, still trying, even now, to offer some path toward de-escalation. "My military ID as well. I served 2 tours in Vietnam. I lost my sight in service to this country. I am asking you, respectfully, to verify who I am before this goes any further." "We'll take a look," Colton said dismissively, though the tone suggested he had no genuine interest in doing so, more concerned with completing whatever search he'd already decided the situation warranted than with actually resolving the obvious mismatch between the reported disturbance and the elderly, clearly harmless man in front of him. The officers proceeded to search Samuel's home without meaningful cause, moving through rooms with careless disregard for his carefully organized belongings. Belongings arranged with the precise, deliberate order that allowed a blind man to navigate his own space with confidence. Drawers were left open, furniture shifted, the quiet dignity of Samuel's carefully maintained independence disrupted by men who never once paused to consider the disproportionate impact their carelessness might have on someone who relied so completely on spatial memory to function. By the time Rosalind Fitch could no longer contain her outrage, stepping off her porch to intervene verbally, several more neighbors had gathered, watching in stunned silence as a decorated, blind war veteran sat handcuffed on his own porch steps, his cane still lying just out of reach where it had fallen. Rosalind's hands trembled as she dialed Marcus's number, a contact Samuel had given her years earlier for exactly this kind of emergency, though she'd never imagined actually needing to use it. "This is Marcus," he answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the brisk professionalism of a federal agent mid-workday. "Marcus, it's Rosalind, your dad's neighbor," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "You need to listen to me. The police are at your father's house right now. They've handcuffed him. He's on the ground. They shoved him, Marcus. They actually shoved him." The words landed like a physical blow. Marcus, seated at his desk in a federal field office 3 states away, felt every ounce of professional composure evaporate instantly. Is he hurt? Rosalind, is he hurt? He's shaken up, his shoulder. I don't know, Marcus. Please, you need to do something. I'm calling Elijah right now, Marcus said, already rising from his desk, his mind racing through every protocol he knew for exactly this kind of emergency. Stay with him if you can. Don't let them take him anywhere without knowing where. He ended the call and immediately dialed his brother, his hands moving with the same disciplined urgency Samuel had instilled in both of them since childhood. Elijah, it's Dad, Marcus said the moment his brother picked up. Elmridge PD has him detained. Rosalind says they shoved him to the ground. Elijah, 4 hours closer to Elm Ridge in his regional DEA office, was already grabbing his keys before Marcus finished the sentence. I'm leaving now. Call whoever you need to call. I'll call ahead to the department myself. Marcus, meanwhile, was already moving toward his supervisor's office, requesting emergency clearance for personal travel while simultaneously placing a call to a DOJ civil rights liaison he'd worked alongside on a previous case, a contact that would prove critical in formally flagging the incident as a potential civil rights violation involving a disabled elderly veteran, language that, once entered into the federal system, would move with considerably more urgency than any local department complaint ever could. Back in Elm Ridge, Samuel had been placed in the back of Colton's cruiser, his cane still left behind on the porch, his hands cuffed uncomfortably behind him. The 11-minute drive to the station passed in disorienting silence, Samuel's careful mental map of his surroundings rendered useless by the unfamiliar turns and stops of a vehicle he had no control over. For questioning, Colton had explained flatly when Samuel asked, once again, exactly what charge justified his continued detention. Disturbance report. We'll sort it out at the station. At the booking desk, a young officer named Priya Anand processed Samuel's information with visible, if unspoken, discomfort. The obvious disconnect between the elderly, clearly disabled man in front of her and the aggressive escalation described in Colton's incident report nagging at some deeper professional instinct she hadn't yet found the courage to act on. Sir, do you need any medical attention? She asked quietly, noting the slight wince Samuel made as he shifted his weight in the holding area chair. My shoulder, Samuel admitted. But what I need more than anything, officer, is for someone to actually listen to me. I am a decorated veteran. I have lived at my address for 32 years. There has been a serious mistake here, and every minute that passes without correction is a minute of unnecessary harm. I'll note that, Anand said, though her authority to do anything more meaningful than note it remained limited within the department's existing chain of command. Whitfield, passing by the booking desk, offered nothing but a dismissive wave of his hand. He'll be fine. Old habit of these guys. Always got a sob story ready. Samuel, seated in the holding area with his hands finally uncuffed, focused on his breathing, on the discipline that had carried him through combat and blindness and 30 years of solitary fatherhood, refusing to let the humiliation of the moment break the composure he had spent a lifetime cultivating. He didn't yet know that, at that exact moment, his sons were already in motion, converging on Elm Ridge with a speed and determination that would, within the hour, upend everything about how this day was supposed to end. Elijah arrived first, having driven the 4-hour distance in just under 3, his federal DEA badge already in hand as he pushed through the precinct's front doors with controlled, forceful urgency. I need to know the status of Samuel Carter, detained here within the last 2 hours, Elijah said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a man who had spent a decade learning exactly how to command a room without raising his voice. The young officer at the front desk, unprepared for the sudden presence of a federal agent demanding answers, stammered through an attempt at protocol. Sir, I'd need to check with... Check now, Elijah said, sliding his credentials across the counter. That man is my father. I want him released, medically evaluated, and I want to speak with whoever authorized his detention immediately. Word spread through the bullpen with startling speed, officers exchanging uneasy glances as the reality of the situation began settling over the department. Sergeant Whitfield, emerging from a back office to assess the sudden commotion, felt his stomach drop at the sight of the federal badge in Elijah's hand. There's been a misunderstanding, Whitfield began, though the words carried none of their earlier dismissive confidence. There's been considerably more than a misunderstanding, Elijah replied evenly. You detained a 78-year-old blind combat veteran based on a clerical error, physically assaulted him during the process, and denied him basic dignity throughout. I'd like to see him now. What? Marcus arrived 20 minutes later, having caught the first available flight, accompanied by a DOJ civil rights liaison, whose presence alone signaled the gravity with which the incident was now being treated at the federal level. Officer Colton, summoned to the front of the bullpen to explain his conduct, found himself unable to offer anything beyond stammered justifications that collapsed almost immediately under the calm, evidence-based pressure both brothers applied. You didn't verify the address, Marcus said simply. You didn't verify his identity when he offered it to you. You didn't stop when a visibly blind, elderly man told you repeatedly that a mistake had been made. That's not an error in judgment, Officer Colton. That's a failure of basic duty. Samuel heard the commotion from the holding area before he fully understood what was happening. Familiar voices, unmistakable despite the passage of years, cutting through the ambient noise of the precinct with an urgency that made his chest tighten with sudden, overwhelming recognition. Dad, Elijah said, his voice breaking slightly as he reached the holding area, the composed federal agent giving way, just for a moment, to the frightened boy who had once needed this same man to hold him through countless childhood storms. Elijah, Samuel said, rising carefully from his seat, reaching instinctively toward the sound of his son's voice. And Marcus, I hear you too. We're here, Dad, Marcus said, his own voice thick with emotion as he crossed the room to embrace his father, careful of the shoulder Samuel had favored since the fall. We're getting you out of here right now. The reunion, brief as it was amid the ongoing chaos of the precinct, carried the full weight of everything the three of them had built together over 30 years. A debt of care and sacrifice now, in this unexpected way, coming full circle. I'm all right, Samuel said quietly, though the slight tremor in his voice betrayed the toll the day had taken. Shaken, but all right. I'm more concerned with ensuring this doesn't happen to someone else who doesn't have two federal agents to call. It was in many ways a perfectly Samuel response, even in his own moment of vindication, his mind already turning toward the broader accountability the situation demanded, rather than any personal sense of vengeance against the men who had wronged him. Once Samuel had been formally released and given an immediate medical evaluation for his shoulder, a moderate contusion that would heal, though the attending paramedic noted it easily could have resulted in a fracture given his age, Marcus and Elijah turned their full attention to the department's broader accountability. We're formally requesting a federal civil rights review of this department's protocols regarding elderly and disabled residents, Marcus told the precinct's captain, who had by then arrived, visibly alarmed by the scale of the situation unfolding under his command. This isn't the first complaint of this nature we're aware of. We intend to ensure it's thoroughly investigated. The DOJ liaison, who had accompanied Marcus from the airport, confirmed that a formal inquiry would be opened immediately, beginning with a review of Officer Colton's personnel file, which, once examined, revealed 2 prior excessive force complaints from the preceding 18 months, neither of which had resulted in meaningful disciplinary action. Sergeant Whitfield's own record, once scrutinized, revealed a broader pattern of dismissive, sometimes negligent oversight, complaints from elderly and disabled residents that had been quietly closed without substantive investigation, a pattern that painted a troubling picture of institutional indifference stretching back years. Rosalind Fitch's video footage, once submitted to investigators, became a central piece of evidence corroborating every detail of Samuel's account. Its unflinching documentation of the shove, the handcuffing, and the dismissive treatment leaving little room for the kind of ambiguity that so often protected officers in similar cases. The formal investigation that followed moved with unusual speed, propelled in no small part by the involvement of 2 federal agents whose personal connection to the case ensured a level of scrutiny the department could not easily deflect or delay. Within weeks, the DOJ's Civil Rights Division had compiled a comprehensive report documenting not just the specifics of Samuel's wrongful detention, but a broader pattern of careless, sometimes forceful conduct toward elderly and disabled residents across Elm Ridge, stretching back nearly 5 years. At trial months later, the evidence proved overwhelming. Rosalind's footage, combined with Samuel's own composed, detailed testimony and corroborating statements from both Marcus and Elijah regarding their father's obvious disability and the department's failure to verify basic facts before escalating to physical force left the defense with little meaningful ground to stand on. Officer Colton's attorney attempted to argue reasonable mistake, suggesting his client had acted in good faith based on the information available to him. The argument collapsed almost immediately under cross-examination, particularly once prosecutors highlighted Samuel's white cane, clearly visible in Rosalind's footage from the moment he opened his own front door, a detail that made the officers' continued escalation rather than any genuine confusion the central issue at hand. Colton was found liable for excessive force and deprivation of rights, resulting in termination from the department and a formal ban from future law enforcement employment within the state. Whitfield, found to have enabled and failed to properly supervise the encounter despite his considerably greater experience, faced his own departmental consequences, ultimately resigning under mounting pressure before formal termination proceedings could conclude. The department, under the terms of the resulting consent agreement with federal investigators, was mandated to implement comprehensive disability awareness training for all officers, alongside revised verification protocols requiring dispatch confirmation of address accuracy before any residential response involving potential use of force. Months later, on a warm spring evening, Samuel sat on his familiar porch, the same steps where everything had unfolded, though the scene now carried a considerably different energy. Marcus and Elijah sat beside him, having both taken time away from their demanding careers to spend an extended weekend with the man who had given them everything, long before either of them had any way of repaying it. "You know," Samuel said quietly, his weathered hands resting calmly in his lap, "I never once, in 30 years of raising you two, imagined a day would come where you'd be the ones protecting me." "You spent 30 years protecting us first, Dad," Elijah said. "Every single day. We were just returning what you already gave." Samuel smiled, the same patient, knowing smile both brothers had grown up trusting completely. "I didn't raise you boys expecting anything in return. I raised you because it was right, because two children needed someone, and I happened to be the man standing there that night." "That's exactly why it mattered so much when you needed us," Marcus said, "because you never once made it feel like an obligation. It was always just love." The three of them sat together in comfortable silence as the evening settled over Elmridge, the same neighborhood that had once quietly supported a blind man raising two abandoned boys, now bearing witness to the full, unlikely circle their story had completed. Samuel, unable to see the sky deepening into evening color above them, felt it instead in the warmth of his son's presence beside him. Proof, if he'd ever needed any, that the dignity he'd spent a lifetime protecting, even without sight, had never once gone unseen by the two people who mattered most. True strength was never about what someone could see, but about what they chose to build in spite of every obstacle in front of them. If this story moved you, hit that like button. It helps this channel grow. Share it with someone who needs to see justice and love win together. And subscribe, because next week, another powerful story of sacrifice and justice is coming your way. See you in the next one.